So you want to own a dental practice, a genuinely respected profession, 6 figures of earning potential, and a business that, unlike most retail categories, people can't simply avoid forever. The average dental practice owner in America takes home somewhere around $695,000 a year. That's the number every dental school graduate has in the back of their mind while paying down student debt. Here's the legal detail that should surprise you before you assume that number is guaranteed just because you own the practice. In most states, it is technically illegal for a private equity firm or any non-dentist to directly own a dental practice. Laws against the corporate practice of dentistry have existed for decades, specifically to keep clinical decisions in the hands of licensed dentists. And yet, some of the largest financial firms in the world, including KKR, Leonard Green and Partners, and Ares Management, have poured billions of dollars into dental consolidation anyway. Nearly 200 such acquisition deals closed in just 2024. The number of dental support organizations operating in the U.S. grew from around 100 in 2010 to more than 2,000 by 2023. They found a legal workaround, and understanding it is the key to understanding why so many independent dentists eventually stop being independent. Owning a dental practice isn't one business. It's 3, all treating the same patients in the same kind of chair. Version 1, the fully independent practice. A dentist owns the practice outright, makes every clinical and business decision personally, and keeps the entire profit margin. This is the highest upside version, and also the version most exposed to every cost pressure hitting the industry, with nothing to absorb it but the owner's own balance sheet. Version 2, the DSO-affiliated practice. The dentist still nominally owns the practice's professional corporation, since state law generally requires that, but has sold the underlying business assets, equipment, goodwill, and patient records to a dental support organization and signed a long-term management services agreement handing day-to-day operational and financial control to that organization in exchange for a management fee. Version 3, the DSO employed associate. After an acquisition's earn-out period ends, or for a dentist who never owned a practice at all, the dentist works purely as an employee inside a DSO-run office, drawing a steady salary with none of the ownership upside, but also none of the balance sheet risk. Opening a new dental practice from scratch is a genuinely capital-intensive undertaking. Equipment and technology alone, imaging systems, CAD/CAM machines, sterilization infrastructure typically account for around 43% of total startup cost, commonly running around $325,000. Build-out and construction adds another 24%, roughly $185,000, and working capital to cover the practice through its early months makes up another 19%, around $145,000. Add hidden costs that first-time owners routinely underestimate, technology integration and regulatory compliance among them, and total startup capital can climb by another $180,000 on top of the headline equipment and build-out numbers. Most new practices lose money for the first 6 to 12 months of operation. Reaching the roughly $195,000 owner income benchmark typically requires at least 200 actively returning patients and genuinely efficient scheduling, neither of which arrives on day one. Here's where the numbers get genuinely confusing, and the confusion isn't accidental. Established independent practices commonly report gross profit margins of 30 to 40%, with specialties like orthodontics and oral surgery frequently exceeding 40% given higher case values. But some sources note that total overhead can run as high as 75% at less efficient practices, leaving a net margin closer to 25% or lower once every cost is actually accounted for. DSO-affiliated clinics complicate the picture further. At the individual clinic level, a DSO-supported location can showcase EBITDA margins exceeding 45%. Because a substantial share of administrative costs, the exact overhead an independent owner has to absorb directly gets moved off that individual clinic's books and onto the parent organization's ledger instead. Once you account for the DSO's own regional management fees, centralized marketing spend, and corporate overhead at the enterprise level, the real consolidated margin normalizes back down to somewhere between 28 and 33%. The 45% number a DSO might show a prospective seller isn't false. It's just measuring a different, narrower slice of the actual cost structure than an independent owner has to. Now for the cost pressure that explains why so many independent owners eventually sell, even when they genuinely prefer to stay independent. Since 2020, PPO insurance reimbursement rates have declined by roughly 12%, while practice operating costs have climbed by around 23% over the same stretch, a genuine scissors effect squeezing margin from both directions at once. On a typical PPO plan, insurance reimburses somewhere between 60 and 75% of a practice's standard fee schedule, meaning a meaningful share of every billed procedure gets written off before the practice ever collects it. Layer on an average insurance claim processing time of 47 days, while rent, payroll, and supply costs come due daily, and cash flow gaps become a routine structural feature of running an independent practice rather than an occasional headache. At the same time, staffing costs have climbed sharply. Dental hygienist salaries have risen roughly 34% since 2020, and dental assistant wages have climbed about 28%, driven by a genuine shortage of qualified clinical staff. An independent practice absorbing all three pressures simultaneously, declining reimbursement, delayed cash flow, and rising labor costs, is exactly the kind of financially exhausted seller a dental support organization is built to find and acquire. Here's the structural detail that makes dental consolidation different from almost every other industry in this series. Corporate practice of dentistry laws in most states genuinely do prohibit a non-dentist, including a private equity firm, from owning a dental practice's clinical operations outright. Private equity found a way around that restriction rather than through it. A dental support organization acquires the practice's non-clinical assets, its equipment, its goodwill, its patient records, and the cash flow those assets generate, while a licensed dentist retains formal legal ownership of the underlying professional corporation, satisfying the letter of the law. In exchange, that dentist-owned entity signs a long-term management services agreement handing effective day-to-day control and a substantial ongoing management fee to the DSO. This structure has scaled dramatically. As of 2024, roughly 16% of American dentists had some form of DSO affiliation, more than double the share from just 9 years earlier. The top 10 dental support organizations alone now oversee close to 7,000 offices combined. And the private equity firms behind many of these platforms run a familiar playbook. Acquire a group of practices, tighten costs and standardize operations, then sell the entire consolidated platform to a larger buyer within roughly 3 to 5 years. The DSO that manages your practice today is frequently not the DSO that will manage it after its next sale. There's one more detail that matters enormously to any dentist considering this exit. A typical DSO acquisition doesn't pay the full purchase price up front. A common structure pays roughly 60% of the agreed value at closing, with the remaining 40% structured as an earnout, contingent on the selling dentist staying on as an employee for another 3 to 5 years and hitting performance targets set by the very organization that now controls scheduling, staffing, and clinical operations. Valuations in this market typically run 5 to 9 times EBITDA, with the highest multiples reserved for practices collecting more than $1.5 million annually with modern technology and a stable clinical team. The dentist who sells gives up operational control immediately. The final payday depends on performance inside a system they no longer run. Scenario 1. A dentist builds an independent practice with a deliberately managed insurance mix, limiting the lowest reimbursing PPO plans rather than accepting every network available, and invests early in staff retention to avoid the turnover costs driving up hygienist and assistant wages elsewhere. Efficient scheduling and a strong fee-for-service and cash-pay patient base keep the practice's real net margin closer to 30% than 20%. His owner reaches and holds something close to the $695,000 average practice owner income, and despite regular inbound interest from regional DSO platforms, has no structural reason to sell. Scenario 2. A dentist opens a similarly sized independent practice but accepts a broad mix of PPO networks to maximize patient volume early on, without fully accounting for how much of each billed procedure those networks actually reimburse. Rising hygienist and assistant wages, combined with reimbursement rates that keep declining relative to costs, compress the practice's real margin toward the lower end of the range within a few years. Facing a widening gap between what the practice can sustainably pay staff and what nearby DSO-backed offices are offering to poach them, the dentist eventually sells to a dental support organization at a 5 to 6 times EBITDA multiple, well below what a larger, more efficient practice would command, with 40% of the payout contingent on a multi-year earnout inside a system now run by someone else. So the next time someone describes owning a dental practice as one of the most dependable paths to a 6-figure income, the $695,000 average is real for the owners who keep enough margin and enough control to actually collect it. But underneath that number sits a genuine legal firewall, corporate practice of dentistry law, that private equity has learned to root around rather than break, and an insurance reimbursement squeeze quietly pushing exhausted independent owners toward exactly the kind of deal that Firewall was supposed to make unnecessary. The dental chair was never really the business. The insurance mix, the management services agreement waiting in the wings, and whether you can hold your margin long enough to never need it, that's the real economics of this business.